If you're wondering how America almost lost the Revolutionary War, not to the British, but to complete financial collapse and the total breakdown of government, make sure you hit that subscribe button. This is the story of how the United States nearly died before it was even born, and how a few desperate men fought to create something that had never existed before, a continental republic that could actually function. Our respective governments which compose the Union, so ran the circular of Congress to the states in the opening of the year 1779, are settled and in the vigorous exercise of uncontrolled authority. The Union itself was without credit and unable to enforce the collection of taxes. About 106 millions of paper money were then in circulation, and in April 1779 it stood at 5 cents. For the service of the year 1779, Congress invited the states to pay by installments their respective quotas of 15 millions, and further to pay 6 millions annually for 18 years as a fund to sink all previous emissions and obligations. After these preliminaries, a new issue of a little more than 50 millions was authorized. The state of the currency was the great impediment to all vigorous measures. It became a question whether men, if they could be raised, could be subsisted. The Pennsylvania farmers were unwilling to sell their wheat except for hard money. There was no hope of relief but from the central authority. To confederate without Maryland was the opinion of Connecticut, with 9 or more states of Boston, with so many as shall be willing to do so, allowing to the rest a time during which they might come in, of Virginia. Late in May, Congress apportioned among the states $45 millions more, though there was no chance that the former apportionment would be paid. 4 times in the course of the year it sent forth addresses to the several states. Newspapers, town meetings, legislatures teemed with remedial plans, but the issue of paper constantly increased and its value fell with accelerated velocity. In the middle of August, when a paper dollar was worth but 3 or 4 cents, Washington directed his agents to receive it no longer, for the legal tender law countenanced dishonesty. Think about that for a moment. The commander-in-chief of the Continental Army ordering his own supply officers not to accept United States currency because it was essentially worthless. That's where America stood in 1779, not defeated by British arms, but collapsing from within because there was no functioning government. On the 2nd of September, Congress, having ascertained that the sum of outstanding emissions was but little short of 160 millions, limited paper money to 200 millions, and the limit was reached before the end of the year. In October, it appointed Henry Lawrence of South Carolina to negotiate a loan of 10 millions in the Netherlands, though they had not yet acknowledged the existence of the United States, and in November, it resolved to draw on him on time for 100,000 pounds sterling. It resolved to draw on Jay, their minister at Madrid, for as much more, which he was left to get from the King of Spain, though that king was the most determined foe to the independence of the United States. Lawrence and Jay were instructed mutually to support each other, though neither of them had any but imaginary resources. Congress was literally writing checks on accounts that didn't exist, hoping that somehow, somewhere, someone would honor them. In the midst of these financial straits, the year came to an end, and a paper dollar, which when first buoyed up by the French alliance was valued at 20 cents, in January 1779 had fallen to 12.5 cents, in April to 5 cents, in December to less than 2.5 cents. The legislature of Virginia had on the 2nd of June 1779 unanimously ratified the treaties of alliance and commerce between France and the United States, and the governor had, under the seal of the Commonwealth, notified the French envoy at Philadelphia of the act. The legislature of Maryland formally approved the act of its delegates in Congress in ratifying the treaties. No other state followed these examples. Vergennes, in September, after reflecting on the procedure of Virginia, gave instructions to Girard in these words: "During the war it is essential, both for the United States and for us, that their union should be as perfect as possible. When they shall be left to themselves, the General Confederation will have much difficulty in maintaining itself and will perhaps be replaced by separate confederations. Should this revolution occur, it will weaken the United States, which have not now and never will have real and respectable strength except by their union. But it is for themselves alone to make these reflections. We have no right to present them for their consideration, and we have no interest whatever to see America play the part of a power. The French foreign minister himself believed that the United States would probably break apart into separate confederations once the war ended. That's how fragile this new nation was. Even France, America's essential ally, didn't believe the Union would last. The sentiment of Congress was strong against the exercise of a separate voice on a subject reserved exclusively for the deliberation of the Confederacy. Before the war was ended, both Maryland and Virginia applied directly to France for assistance, which Virginia received. On the question of a closer union, Virginia hung nearly on the balance. The first of her citizens, at the head of the army, was using all his powers of persuasion to promote an efficient government, and her legislature selected Madison, a friend to Union, as one of her representatives. On the other hand, as the chief claimant of Northwestern lands in opposition to Congress, she, above all others, asserted the sovereignty of the separate states. Congress had received petitions from persons claiming to be companies holding land northwest of the Ohio. Should Congress assume a jurisdiction, such was the remonstrance of the General Assembly of Virginia, it would be a violation of public faith, introduce a most dangerous precedent which might hereafter be urged to deprive of territory or subvert the sovereignty and government of any one or more of the United American States, or unwarranted by the Articles of Confederation. Congress, on mature consideration, declined the discussion of the remonstrance. To counterbalance the sturdy resistance of Virginia, the legislature of New York took the field. They founded claims to Western territory on the discoveries and the capitulation of the Dutch, on the grant from Charles II to the Duke of York, and on the acquisition of the rights of the Five Nations and their tributaries as the native proprietors. Desirous to accelerate the federal alliance, on the 19th of April, 1780, they authorized Congress to restrict their boundaries on the west. This is the first important act of the states in surrendering public lands to the federal union. At the opening of the year 1780, Congress found itself helpless and threw everything upon the states. In truth, it could do nothing else. On the 9th of February, it fixed the number of men necessary for the service of the year at over 35,211 and required the states to furnish by drafts or otherwise, before the first day of the coming April, the respective deficiencies in their quotas, which were prescribed with exactness. To subsist the troops, Congress called on the several states to furnish their respective quotas of supplies for the ensuing season, thus shoving off from itself all care for recruiting the army and all responsibility for its support. To gain money, it directed the states to bring into the Continental Treasury by taxes or otherwise $1,250,000 every month to the month of April 1780 inclusive, in hard money or with $40 in the old bills for $1 of the tax. The bills that should be thus brought in were to be destroyed, and for every $40 actually canceled, $2 were permitted of a new issue bearing 5% interest, receivable by the Continental Treasury as specie and redeemable by the several states on or before the last day of December 1786.
As fast as the new bills should be signed and emitted, the states respectively on whose funds they were to be issued were to receive 3/5 of them. The remaining 2/5 were to be subject to the order of the United States and to be duly credited to the several states. All laws on legal tender were to be adapted to the new system. The elaborate plan was generally well received, though by a mere vote it sponged out 39/40ths of the former currency. As the bills were to be issued in the names of the several states, the plan could not go into effect till each one of them should give authority for the use of its name. Meantime, the demands on the Confederacy were in part answered by warrants on the several states. And to discharge these warrants, the states used the taxes collected for the Continental Treasury. Pennsylvania was the first state that had the opportunity to accept the measure, and it adjourned without acting upon it. The legislature of Virginia rejected it by an overwhelming majority, and at last, after great persuasion, accepted it by a majority of but 2. The old currency soon ceased to circulate. The new emission wanted credit from the beginning. A cry arose, especially in the Army, for an efficient government. While the powers of Congress, wrote Greene, are so incompetent, our affairs will grow worse and worse until ruin overtakes us. In the Army, which had been unpaid for 5 months, every department was without money and without the shadow of credit. To relieve this gloomy state of things, Congress on the 10th of April, 1780, promised to make good to the officers in line the depreciation in their pay, but the promise was little worth. For a long time, the troops received only from 1/2 to 1/8 of a ration of meat and were several days without a single pound of it. Washington appealed to Reed, the president of the rich state of Pennsylvania, which except for a few months in 1777 and 1778 had been untouched by the war, but it was in vain. The great man, wrote Greene secretly to the president of Pennsylvania, is confounded at his situation, but appears to be reserved and silent. Should there be a want of provisions, we cannot hold together many days in the present temper of the army. On the 25th of May, 2 regiments of Connecticut, worn out by want of clothes and food and pay, paraded under arms, declaring their resolution to return home or to obtain subsistence for themselves. And they were brought back to their duty only by being reminded that they were defenders of the rights of mankind, and as a grave writer who was then with the army relates, by the influence of the commander-in-chief, whom they almost adored. The enemy appeared against them in the midst of these trials, and they rallied as one man and kept him at bay. "Certain I am," wrote Washington in May to his friend Joseph Jones of King George, a delegate in Congress from Virginia, "unless Congress are vested by the several states with powers competent to the great purposes of war, or assume them as a matter of right, and they and the states respectively act with more energy than they have hitherto done, our cause is lost. By ill timing in the adoption of measures, by delays in the execution of them, or by unwarrantable jealousies, we incur enormous expenses and derive no benefit from them. One state will comply with a requisition of Congress, another neglects to do it, a third executes it by halves, and all differ either in the manner, the matter, or so much in point of time that we are always working uphill. While the present want of system prevails, we shall ever be unable to apply our strength or resources to any advantage. This, my dear sir, is plain language to a member of Congress, but is the result of long thinking, close application, and strict observation. I see one head gradually changing into 13. I see one army branching into 13, which instead of looking up to Congress as the supreme controlling power of the United States, are considering themselves as dependent on their respective states. In a word, I see the powers of Congress declining too fast for the consideration and respect which are due to them as the great representative body of America, and I am fearful of the consequences."
Congress, answered his correspondent, have scarcely a power left but such as concerns foreign transactions. For as to the army, they are at present little more than the medium through which its wants are conveyed to the states. This body never had, or at least in few instances ever exercised, powers adequate to the purposes of war, and indeed such as they possessed have been frittered away to the states, and it will be found very difficult to recover them. Resolutions are now before us, by one of which the states are desired to give express powers for the common defense. Others go to the assumption of them immediately. The first will sleep with the states, the others will die where they are, so cautious are some of offending the states. When it became certain that troops from France were on their way to assist the country, Congress made not even a semblance of direct action and could only entreat the states to correspond severally with its committee at headquarters so that it might explicitly know how far they could be relied on to furnish the men and money and provisions that had been called for. The legislature of Pennsylvania, before its adjournment, vested large discretionary powers in President Reed, but these he declined to use. In June, steps were taken at Philadelphia for founding a bank with leave to issue notes. The subscribers proposed, but only on adequate security, to make purchases in advance for the suffering soldiers. Congress accepted the proffer of aid and further resolved to entrust to the company as much of its paper money as could be spared from other services. Thus began the deposit of funds of the United States in a bank. The women of Philadelphia, rallying round the amiable Esther Reed, wife of the President of Pennsylvania, brought together large donations of clothing and invited the ladies of other states to adopt a like plan. They thus assisted to keep alive the spirit of patriotism in the Army, but their gifts could not meet its ever-recurring wants. When Congress drew supplies in kind directly from each state for its own troops, quotas were sometimes apportioned by the states to their towns and in towns to individuals. Men of small means in a New England village would club together to buy an ox of a weight equal to their collective quotas, and herds of cattle so gathered were driven to the camp. All this marked an active spirit of patriotism, reaching to the humblest and remotest, but it showed the want of organized power. Toward the end of June, Greene wrote, "I have for a long time seen the necessity of some new plan of civil constitution. Unless there is some control over the states by the Congress, we shall soon be like a broken band." Even with his energy, there could be no efficient administration in the quartermaster's department, though it had been placed on a centralized system under his immediate authority, with powers almost independent of Congress and with exorbitant emoluments for himself, his assistants, and subordinates. The system itself, in the hands of a bad man, would have opened the way to endless abuses, and Congress wisely restored its own controlling civil supervision. Dismissing a useless supernumerary, it determined to have but one head of the quartermaster's department at the seat of Congress and one at the camp, and in paying the officers of the staff, it returned to salaries instead of commissions. The unanimous judgment of the country from that day to this has approved the reform. Greene resigned with petulant abruptness. His successor in the quartermaster's department was Timothy Pickering, who excelled him as a man of business, was content with moderate pay, and was singularly frugal and exact, so that the service suffered nothing by the change. The tendency to leave all power in the hands of the separate states was a natural consequence of their historic development, and was confirmed by pressing necessity. A single assembly, so John Adams long continued to reason, is every way adequate to the management of all the federal concerns of the people of America, because Congress is not a legislative nor a representative, but a diplomatic assembly. Congress having requested the 8 states north of Maryland to convene in New Haven in January 1778, all but Delaware appeared, but they strove in vain to regulate prices. The Convention of the Eastern States, which at the instance of Massachusetts assembled in 1779 at Hartford, is memorable for having advised a convention of all the states in Philadelphia. In consequence, early in 1780, delegates from every state north of Virginia except New York met in that city, but accomplished nothing.
By the meeting of the Eastern States in August 1780 at Boston, the first step was taken toward the formation of a federal constitution. After adopting a series of measures best suited to the campaign, they resolved that the union of these states be fixed in a more solid and permanent manner, that the powers of Congress be more clearly ascertained and defined, that the important national concerns of the United States be under the superintendency and direction of one supreme head,
that it be recommended to the states to empower their delegates in Congress to confederate with such of the states as will accede to the proposed confederation, and that they invest their delegates in Congress with powers competent for the government and direction of all those common and national affairs which do not nor can come within the jurisdiction of the particular states. These resolutions, wrote Washington to Bowdoin, then President of the Council of Massachusetts, if adopted, will be the means most likely to rescue our affairs from the complicated and dreadful embarrassments under which they labor, and will do infinite honor to those with whom they originate. I sincerely wish they may meet with no opposition or delay in their progress. The words of the Boston Convention sunk deeply into the mind of Hamilton, who for 3.5 years had been Washington's most able and confidential secretary, and under his eye and guidance had watched the course of affairs from the central point where they could best be overseen. To these opportunities, he added the resources of an inventive and fearless mind, the quick impulses of youth, and the habit of steady and severe reflection. Uncontrolled by birth or inherited attachments to any one state, he fastened upon the idea of a stronger union. By disposition and temperament, he demanded a strong and well-organized government. From childhood, he was unbounded in his admiration of the English Constitution and did not utterly condemn its methods of corruption in the conduct of public affairs. Yet, in his own nature, there was nothing sordid or low. He was always true to the sense of personal integrity and honor. The character of his mind and his leaning to authority, combined with something of a mean opinion of his fellow men, cut him off from the sympathy of the masses, so that he was in many ways unfit to lead a party, and the years of his life which were most productive of good were those in which he acted under Washington. On the 3rd of September 1780, Hamilton took the field in behalf of a national constitution by urging Duane, a member of Congress from New York, to hold up to that body the example of the meeting of the New England states, and to call on the first day of the next November a convention of all the states with full authority to conclude finally upon a general confederation. He traced the causes of the want of power in Congress and censured that body for its timidity in refusing to assume authority to preserve the Republic from harm. Undefined powers, he said, are discretionary powers limited only by the object for which they were given, not holding in mind that Congress could not have assumed such powers even if it would. Already, he continued, some of the lines of the army, but for the personal influence of the general, would obey their states in opposition to Congress, notwithstanding the pains taken to preserve the unity of the army. The sovereign of an empire under one simple form of government has too much power. In an empire composed of confederated states, each with a government completely organized within itself, the danger is directly the reverse. We must at all events have a vigorous confederation, he said, if we mean to succeed in the contest and be happy thereafter. Internal police should be regulated by the legislatures. Congress should have complete sovereignty in all that relates to war, peace, trade, finance, foreign affairs, armies, fleets, fortifications, coining money, establishing banks, imposing a land tax, poll tax, duties on trade, and the unoccupied lands. The Confederation should provide certain perpetual revenues, productive and easy of collection, a land tax, poll tax, or the like, which together with the duties on trade and the unlocated lands would give Congress a substantial existence. Where the public good is evidently the object, more may be effected in governments like ours than in any other. It has been a constant remark that free countries have ever paid the heaviest taxes. The obedience of a free people to general laws, however hard they bear, is ever more perfect than that of slaves to the arbitrary will of a prince. As to the plan of Confederation which Congress has proposed, it is, he said, defective and requires to be altered. It is neither fit for war nor peace. The idea of an uncontrollable sovereignty in each state will defeat the powers given to Congress and make our Union feeble and precarious. The second step which Hamilton recommended was the appointment of great officers of state, one for the Department of Foreign Affairs, another for war, a third for the Navy, a fourth for the Treasury. These were to supersede the committees and the boards which had hitherto been usual. But his plan neither went so far as to propose a president with the chief executive power, nor two branches in the national legislature. He would have placed the army exclusively under Congress and valued it as a solid basis of authority and consequence. The precedent of the Bank of England, of which he overestimated the influence on public credit, led him to expect too much from a Bank of the United States. The advice which Hamilton offered from his tent in the midst of an unpaid, half-fed, and half-clad army was the more remarkable from the hopefulness which beamed through his words. No doubt crossed his mind that a republic of United States could embrace a continental territory. 2 days later, Washington, with Duane at his side, gazed from Weehawken Heights on the half-ruined city of New York in her bondage. He never gave himself rest in his efforts to create the system of government which was soon to gather the wealth and commercial representatives of all the nations of the world on that island and the neighboring shores. On the 22nd of October, intent on inspiring his native commonwealth with zeal to lead the way to the establishment of a true union of the states, he poured out his heart to his early friend George Mason. Our present distresses are so great and complicated that it is scarcely within the powers of description to give an adequate idea of them. With regard to our future prospects, unless there is a material change both in our civil and military policy, it will be in vain to contend much longer. We are without money, without provision and forage except what is taken by impress, without clothing, and shortly shall be in a manner without men. In a word, we have lived upon expedients till we can live no longer. The history of this war is a history of temporary devices instead of system and economy which results from it. If we mean to continue our struggles, and it is to be hoped we shall not relinquish our claims, we must do it upon an entire new plan. We must have a permanent force, not a force that is constantly fluctuating and sliding from under us as a pedestal of ice would leave a statue on a summer's day, involving us in expense that baffles all calculation, an expense which no funds are equal to. We must at the same time contrive ways and means to aid our taxes by loans and put our finances upon a more certain and stable footing than they are at present. Our civil government must likewise undergo a reform. Ample powers must be lodged in Congress as the head of the federal union, adequate to all the purposes of war. Unless these things are done, our efforts will be in vain. To accelerate the federal alliance and lead to the happy establishment of the federal union, Congress urged on the states a liberal surrender of their territorial claims in the West, and it provided that the western lands, which might be ceded to the United States, should be settled and formed into distinct republican states that should become members of that federal union and have the same rights of sovereignty, freedom, and independence as the other states. On the 5th of October, in words drafted by Robert R. Livingston, it adhered with hearty goodwill to the principles of the armed neutrality as set forth by Russia. By a vote of a majority of the states, it sought to quiet the discontent among the officers in the army by promising them half pay for life. But to relieve the embarrassments of the moment, it was helpless. On the 4th of November, Congress once more distributed among the several states a tax of 6 millions of silver dollars to be paid partly in specific articles. "It is now 4 days," wrote Glover to Massachusetts on the 11th of December, "since your line of the army has eaten one mouthful of bread.
We have no money, nor will anybody trust us. The best of wheat is at this moment selling in the state of New York for 3/4 of a dollar per bushel, and your army is starving for want. On the 1st of January, something will turn up if not speedily prevented, which your officers cannot be answerable for. When Congress in September 1776 had transferred the enlistment of troops to the states, the new recruits were to bind themselves to serve for the war, but in some cases the enlistment was made for 3 years or for the war, and 3 years had passed since that time. In the night of the 1st of January 1771, a part of the Pennsylvania line at Morristown, composed in a large degree of newcomers from Ireland, revolted, and under the lead of their non-commissioned officers, marched with 6 field pieces to Princeton.
The want of clothes, of food, and of pay for nearly a year, and the compulsion imposed upon some of them to remain in service beyond the 3 years for which they believed they had engaged, were extremities which they would no longer endure. Informed of the mutiny, Sir Henry Clinton passed over to Staten Island with a body of troops for its support, but 2 emissaries whom he sent to them with tempting offers were given up by the mutineers, and after trial were hanged as spies. Reed, the president of Pennsylvania, repaired to the spot, though it was beyond his jurisdiction, and without authority and without due examination of each case, he discharged those who professed to have served out their specified term, while measures were taken by the state of Pennsylvania to clothe and pay the rest. They, for the most part, obtained no more than was due them, but it was of evil tendency that they gained it by a revolt. In a circular letter to the New England states, of which Knox was made the bearer, Washington laid open the aggravated calamities and distresses of the army. Without relief, he said, the worst that can befall us may be expected. I will continue to exert every means I am possessed of to prevent an extension of the mischief, but I can neither foretell nor be answerable for the issue. Troops of New Jersey, whose ranks next to the Pennsylvania line included the largest proportion of foreign-born, showed signs of being influenced by the bad example, but Washington interposed. The 20 regiments of New England in the Continental service had equal reasons for discontent, but they were almost every one of them Native American freeholders or their sons. A detachment of them, marching through deep snows and over mountainous roads, repressed the incipient revolt. The passions of the army were subdued by their patriotism, and order and discipline returned. Human patience has its limits, wrote Lafayette to his wife on the occasion. No European army would suffer the 10th part of what the American troops suffer. It takes citizens to support hunger, nakedness, toil, and the total want of pay which constitute the condition of our soldiers, the hardiest and most patient that are to be found in the world. Knox reported from New England zealous efforts to enlist men for the war. Congress could do nothing and confessed that it could do nothing. We have required, thus it wrote to the states on the 15th of January 1781, aids of men, provisions, and money. The states alone have authority to execute. For the moment, nothing remained for the United States but to appeal to France for rescue, not from a foreign enemy, but from the evils consequent on their own want of government. It was therefore resolved to dispatch to Versailles as a special agent someone who had lived in the midst of the ever-increasing distresses of the army, to set them before the government of France in the most striking light. Hamilton, the fittest man for the office, was passed over, and the choice fell on the younger Lawrence of South Carolina. To him, Washington confided a statement of the condition of the country, and with dignity and candor avowed that it had reached a crisis out of which it could not rise by its own unassisted strength. Without an immediate, ample, and efficacious succor in money, such were his words, we may make a feeble and expiring effort in our next campaign, in all probability the period of our opposition. Next to a loan of money, a constant naval superiority on these coasts is the object most interesting,
And without exaggeration, he explained the rapid advancement of his country in population and prosperity, and the certainty of its redeeming in a short term of years the comparatively inconsiderable debts it might have occasion to contract. To Franklin he wrote in the same strain, and Lafayette addressed a like memorial to Vergennes. The people of the United States, in proportion to numbers, were richer than the people to whose king they were obliged to appeal. Can Louis XVI organize the resources of France, and is Republican America incapable of drawing forth its own? Can monarchy alone give to a nation unity? Is freedom necessarily anarchical? Are authority and the hopes of humanity forever at variance? Are the United States, who so excel the kingdoms of the Old World in liberty, doomed to hopeless inferiority in respect of administration?
For the eye of Robert R. Livingston, then the most influential member from New York, Washington traced to their source the evils under which the country was sinking. "There can be no radical cure," wrote he, "till Congress is vested by the several states with full and ample powers to enact laws for general purposes, and till the executive business is placed in the hands of able and responsible men. Requisitions, then, will be supported by law." In Congress itself, on the 3rd of February, Witherspoon of New Jersey, seconded by Burke of North Carolina, proposed to clothe that body with authority to regulate commerce and to lay duties upon imported articles. The proposition was so far accepted that it was resolved to be indispensably necessary for the states to vest a power in Congress to levy a duty of 5% on importations of articles of foreign growth and manufacture. Yet before that measure could become valid, the separate approval of each one of the 13 states must be gained. The assent of Virginia was promptly given. That great commonwealth, having Jefferson for its governor, earnestly sought to promote peace and union. To hasten peace, it even instructed its delegates in Congress to surrender the right of navigating the Mississippi River below the 31st degree of north latitude, provided Spain in return would guarantee the navigation of the river above that parallel. Madison, obeying the instruction, voted for the measure contrary to his private judgment. Massachusetts, Connecticut, and North Carolina alone opposed, New York being divided. Virginia did more. Avowing her regard for a federal union and preferring the good of the country to every object of smaller importance, she resolved to yield her title to the lands northwest of the Ohio on condition that they should be formed into distinct republican states and be admitted members of the federal union. And Jefferson, who from the first had pledged himself to the measure, announced to Congress this great act of his administration in a letter full of hope for the completion of the American Union and the establishment of free republics in the vast country to which Virginia quitted her claim. The first day of March 1781 was a great day in the history of the country. Maryland, last of the states, subscribed the Articles, and the United States of America, each and every of the 13, adopted, confirmed, and ratified their Confederation and perpetual Union. The states of the United States, in establishing the Confederation, established no government. In the draft of Dickinson, the Confederation was an alliance of sovereigns. Every change in it increased the relative power of the states. The original report permitted each of them to impose duties on imports and exports, provided they did not interfere with stipulations in treaties. This restriction was confined to the treaties already proposed to France and Spain. No power to prohibit the slave trade was granted. In troops raised for the common defense, the appointment of field and inferior officers was reserved to the several states. Congress was in future to be chosen annually and on every first Monday of November to organize itself anew. A majority of the states present had thus far decided every question. The Confederation, which forthwith took effect, required the presence and assent of 7 states, an absolute majority of all, to decide even the most trifling motion, and of 9 states, that is 2/3 of all, to carry every important measure of peace or war, of treaties or finance. Further,
Each state retained its sovereignty and every attribute not expressly delegated to the United States, and by the denial of all incidental powers, the exercise of the granted powers was rendered impracticable. By the Articles of Confederation, Congress alone had the right to treat with foreign nations, but it provided no method for enforcing treaties so that the engagements on the part of the nation might be violated at the will of any one of its members. Congress was to defray expenses for the common defense or general welfare out of a common treasury, but there was no independent treasury. The taxes were to be laid and levied by the legislatures of the several states. Moreover, the quotas of the states were to be assigned in proportion to the value of all real estate within each state, and that value each state was to estimate for itself. Congress, which had no direct power to levy any money whatever, could not even assign to the states their quotas till every one of the 13 should have completed its valuation.
The states might tax imports as much as they pleased. Congress could not tax them at all. It could declare war, but had not power to bring a single citizen into the field. The states of America had formed not a union, but a confederation which acted not on individuals, but only on each separate sovereignty. Room for amendment seemed to be provided for, but an amendment could not take place without the simultaneous consent of every member of the League. With every day, men would grow more attached to their separate states, for many of these had the best governments in the world, while the Confederation was one of the worst, or was rather no government at all. Washington was the first to perceive the defects of the Confederation and the first to urge its reform. On the day before it was adopted, he had explained to a young member of the Virginia legislature the necessity of a controlling power to regulate and direct all matters of general concern. The great business of war, he said, never can be well conducted if it can be conducted at all, while the powers of Congress are only recommendatory. Our independence, our respectability and consequence in Europe, our greatness as a nation hereafter depend upon vesting Congress with competent powers. That body, after hearing the views of the several states fairly discussed, must dictate and not merely recommend. The position of the commander-in-chief required of him unceasing caution. Entrusted with the conduct of the war, no one could see so clearly the absolute necessity of clothing the Confederation with coercive powers over its members. But the vigorous recommendation of the change proceeding from the head of the army that in the last resort would be the instrument of coercion would have increased and apparently justified Congress in its jealousy of the camp. While therefore he wished to support his opinion by all the influence which he could wield, he sought to do it so circumspectly as to awaken no fear of military dictation or a baneful employment of force. The office of preparing a code of laws for Virginia and adapting them to her new relations had been definitively confided to Pendleton, Wythe, and Jefferson. No sooner had a groundwork for national reform been laid by the acceptance of the Confederation than Washington addressed to these three greatest civilians of his native commonwealth the most earnest arguments and entreaties that the manner of coercing a refractory or delinquent state might be clearly laid down and the defects of the Articles of Confederation be seasonably considered and remedied. Danger, he added, may spring from delay, good from a timely application of a remedy. The present temper of the states is friendly to the establishment of a lasting union. The moment should be improved. If suffered to pass away, it may never return, and after gloriously and successfully contending against the usurpations of Britain, we may fall a prey to our own follies and disputes. He was more particularly impelled to express his opinions with freedom because in December 1779, the legislature of Virginia seemed to have censured the idea of enforcing obedience to requisitions. "It would give me concern," he added, "should it be thought of me that I am desirous of enlarging the powers of Congress unnecessarily, as I declare to God my only aim is the general good. A knowledge that this power was lodged in Congress might be the means to prevent its ever being exercised, and the more readily induce obedience.
Indeed, if Congress was unquestionably possessed of the power, nothing should induce the display of it but obstinate disobedience and the urgency of the general welfare. Of this paper, a copy was taken by Joseph Jones of King George, to whom Washington had already expressed himself in plain language. This copy Jones confided to Madison, his colleague in Congress, leaving him to draw his own inference with regard to its author. The Confederation was but a month and a half old when a committee of Congress presented a report drafted by Madison exactly in conformity to this advice of Washington, and, as I believe, in consequence of it, proposing by an amendment to the Articles of Confederation to give to the United States full authority to employ their force, as well by sea as by land, to compel any delinquent state to fulfill its federal engagements. And the reason for the measure, as assigned in the preamble, was to cement and invigorate the federal union, that it might be established on the most immutable basis. In this manner, the idea of granting to the United States power to coerce a delinquent or refractory state entered the hall of Congress, strange and as yet unwelcome and dreaded, yet never to die.
The delicacy and importance of the subject inspired Madison, the author of the report, with the wish to obtain from Jefferson, now governor of Virginia, and one of those to whom Washington had addressed his paper of advice and entreaty, a judgment on the measure before it should undergo the final decision of Congress. He therefore, on the 16th of April, represented to Jefferson the arming of Congress with coercive powers as a necessity arising from the shameful deficiency of some of the states most capable of yielding their apportioned supplies, and the military exactions to which others already exhausted by the enemy and their own troops were in consequence subjected. The expediency, he added, of making the proposed application to the states will depend on the probability of their complying with it. If they should refuse, Congress will be in a worse situation than at present. For as the Confederation now stands, and according to the nature even of alliances much less intimate, there is an implied right of coercion against the delinquent party, and the exercise of it by Congress, whenever a palpable necessity occurs, will probably be acquiesced in. The instrument of coercion which he preferred was a navy. No answer of Jefferson to these inquiries has been found. His opinions, as declared at a later period of the Confederacy, coincide with those of Madison, who from that time strove without rest to establish an efficient system of government for the states in union. In May, he continued to discuss with Pendleton by letters the proper methods of investing Congress with new resources. But no reflecting and far-seeing observer of its relative strength dared hope that its members would be able to remodel the Confederacy. While the American people met obstructions on every side as they slowly sounded their way to an efficient union, Washington, on the first day of May 1781, made a note that instead of magazines, they had but a scanty pittance of provisions scattered here and there in the different states, and poorly provided arsenals which the workmen were leaving. The articles of field equipage were not ready, nor funds to defray the expenses of regular transportation. Scarce any one of the states had as yet sent an eighth part of its quota into the field. And there was no prospect of a glorious offensive campaign unless their generous ally should help them with money and with a fleet strong enough to secure the superiority at sea. This is the reality of the American Revolution that nobody talks about. Not the glory of Valley Forge, not the drama of crossing the Delaware, but the grinding, exhausting, soul-crushing struggle to create a government that could actually govern. Washington wasn't just fighting the British, he was fighting 13 separate republics that couldn't agree on anything, that wouldn't pay their taxes, that wouldn't feed their own soldiers, that let their currency collapse to worthless paper, while men who had sacrificed everything starved in camp. Hamilton saw it from Washington's tent and proposed a solution. A real national government with real power over commerce, over taxation, over war and peace.
Congress should have complete sovereignty in all that relates to war, peace, trade, finance, armies, fleets, fortifications, coining money, imposing a land tax, poll tax, duties on trade, and the unoccupied lands. He understood what most of his contemporaries refused to see, that a confederation of sovereign states wasn't a nation at all, just an alliance that would break apart the moment the external threat was removed. Madison took the cause in Congress. He drafted the first proposal to give the United States power to coerce delinquent states. It was radical. It was frightening to men who had just thrown off one central authority, but it was necessary. The Confederation now stands, he wrote, and according to the nature even of alliances much less intimate, there is an implied right of coercion against the delinquent party. Without the power to compel compliance, Congress was just a diplomatic assembly, a debating society, with no ability to execute its own resolutions.
Washington poured out his frustration to George Mason, to Joseph Jones, to anyone who would listen. We are without money, without provision and forage except what is taken by impress, without clothing, and shortly shall be in a manner without men. In a word, we have lived upon expedients till we can live no longer. The history of this war is a history of temporary devices instead of system and economy which results from it. Ample powers must be lodged in Congress as the head of the federal union, adequate to all the purposes of war. Unless these things are done, our efforts will be in vain. But Washington had to be careful. He commanded the army. Any suggestion from him that Congress needed power to coerce the states could be interpreted as a threat of military dictatorship. So he worked quietly through trusted friends, planting the seeds of constitutional reform, while the army he commanded literally starved for want of bread. "The great man is confounded at his situation," wrote Greene, "but appears to be reserved and silent." The women of Philadelphia collected clothing. New England farmers clubbed together to buy oxen for the army. The Bank of North America was founded to provide credit. All of it was admirable. All of it showed the spirit of patriotism reaching to the humblest and remotest corners of the country. But none of it was a substitute for government. None of it could replace the system and organization that only a true national authority could provide. On March 1, 1781, Maryland finally ratified the Articles of Confederation. The United States of America, each and every of the 13, adopted, confirmed, and ratified their Confederation and perpetual union. It was supposed to be a great day, and in one sense it was. After years of delay, there was finally a formal compact binding all 13 states together. But Washington and Hamilton and Madison knew the truth. The Articles of Confederation weren't a constitution. They were a treaty among sovereigns. Congress had no power to tax. It could only request money from the states, which the states could refuse. It had no power to regulate commerce. Each state could impose its own tariffs and trade restrictions. It could declare war, but couldn't compel a single soldier to serve. It could make treaties, but couldn't enforce them. Any single state could veto any amendment to the Confederation. The states of America had formed not a union, but a confederation, which acted not on individuals, but only on each separate sovereignty. Room for amendment seemed to be provided for, but an amendment could not take place without the simultaneous consent of every member of the League. With every day, men would grow more attached to their separate states, for many of these had the best governments in the world, while the Confederation was one of the worst, or was rather no government at all. This was the crisis, not whether America could win independence from Britain. That question was nearly settled. But whether America could govern itself, whether a free people spread across a continental territory could create a government strong enough to defend itself and execute its laws, yet limited enough to preserve liberty, whether authority and freedom could coexist, or whether mankind must forever choose between tyranny and anarchy.
Can Louis XVI organize the resources of France? Washington asked. And is Republican America incapable of drawing forth its own? Can monarchy alone give to a nation unity? Is freedom necessarily anarchical? Are authority and the hopes of humanity forever at variance? Are the United States, who so excel the kingdoms of the Old World in liberty, doomed to hopeless inferiority in respect of administration? These were the questions that haunted the founders in 1781. They had won their revolution, they had declared their independence, they had formed their Confederation, and they were watching it collapse under its own weakness. The army was mutinying, the currency was worthless, the states were ignoring Congress, and the only solution anyone could propose was to beg France for more money.
Hamilton proposed a national bank, federal taxation, great officers of state, complete sovereignty for Congress over everything related to war, peace, trade, and finance. Madison proposed giving Congress power to use military force against delinquent states. Washington pleaded with Virginia's greatest legal minds to find a way to coerce refractory states within the bounds of law. And Congress could do nothing but write circular letters to the states begging for compliance. The Pennsylvania line mutinied on New Year's Day, 1781. Irishmen mostly, who hadn't been paid in a year, who had no clothes, who were starving, who believed their enlistments had expired. They marched to Princeton with 6 field pieces. Clinton sent agents to recruit them for the British. The mutineers hanged the agents as spies and negotiated with Pennsylvania for their back pay. They got what they wanted. Pennsylvania paid them. It was of evil tendency that they gained it by a revolt. When New Jersey troops tried the same thing, Washington sent New England regiments through the snow to suppress them. The difference wasn't in the justice of their grievances. Both groups had been equally wronged, equally starved, equally cheated of their pay. The difference was that the Pennsylvania line was mostly foreign-born, while the New England regiments were almost every one of them Native American freeholders or their sons. "Human patience has its limits," wrote Lafayette. "No European army would suffer the 10th part of what the American troops suffer. It takes citizens to support hunger, nakedness, toil, and the total want of pay which constitute the condition of our soldiers, the hardiest and most patient that are to be found in the world." That was the paradox. The American soldier was the most patient, the most long-suffering, the most willing to endure hardship for an idea, but that patience had limits. And when those limits were reached, when soldiers were literally starving while farmers in Pennsylvania refused to sell wheat except for hard money, when Congress couldn't pay the army because the states wouldn't pay Congress, when the entire system of government was revealed as impotent and useless, then what? Then Washington had to write to France begging for money because Republican America couldn't organize its own resources. Then young Lawrence had to sail to Versailles with a humiliating confession that the United States had reached a crisis out of which it could not rise by its own unassisted strength. Then the commander-in-chief had to make notes that instead of magazines, they had but a scanty pittance of provisions, that the arsenals were being abandoned, that there was no prospect of a campaign unless France provided both money and naval superiority. This is where America stood in May 1781, independent in name, impotent in fact. The Confederation was 6 weeks old, and already the men who had created it knew it was inadequate. Already Madison was proposing amendments to give it coercive power. Already Washington was explaining that there could be no radical cure till Congress was vested by the several states with full and ample powers to enact laws for general purposes. The idea of granting to the United States power to coerce a delinquent or refractory state entered the hall of Congress, strange and as yet unwelcome and dreaded, yet never to die. That's the seed from which the Constitution would grow.
Not immediately, not easily. 6 more years of failure and frustration would pass before the Constitutional Convention, but the seed was planted in 1781 by men who understood that the Confederation was not a government and could never become one. The American Revolution wasn't won at Yorktown. It was won in Philadelphia in 1787, when 55 men spent a summer creating a government that could actually govern. That's the untold story. That's the crisis that nearly destroyed America before America truly existed. And that's why you need to hit that like button and subscribe, because this channel tells you the history they don't teach in school, the reality behind the myths, the struggles that made America possible.